Hi again. If you've made it this far, that means you've completed your moccasin pattern and you've gathered all your materials. Today we're going to get those materials ready to sew together. All right, before we get started, I thought you might like some inspiration. This is what we will end up with when you're all done working through my videos. Not bad, hey? The first thing we're going to cut out to get ready for assembly is this Sherpa fabric we're using for lining. So you've got your Sherpa and you've got your pattern if you've been following along. If you haven't, you might want to just jump back a couple videos and get caught up. We're going to lay these on the fabric in the way that they fit properly and fully. There we go. Because this fabric is so puffy, it's really hard to pin the pattern down. So instead, I am going to tape the patterns down. Now I'm ready to cut this out. I'm using these awesome, they're Superfection 8-inch double Henckels shears. They cut like butter. Now that I'm done cutting, I want you to notice a couple things. First, I left my notches in place so that when I take my paper off, I can see where they all are. That's going to be important when it comes time to match them up. Next, notice that the fluffy sides are together, which means when I open them, oh, they're backwards, but I get a left and a right. Same thing with these guys. I get a left and a right. So now I have a pair. I can fold these up and put them aside because I'm going to cut out the vamp. Here's the lovely wool I've chosen for my vamp. Once again, that's this material here. So all I need to cut out is 2 of these. Now this particular fabric has a brushed side and a not brushed side. So again, it's going to be important to make sure I get a mirror image. I do that by folding in half, placing my pattern piece on. I'm careful to conserve as much fabric as possible and then cutting it out. So now I've cut out my vamp. There's my lovely notches. I have a left and a right. The last things I need to do for this are first to put on my stabilizing backing. This could be anything, as discussed in a previous video, but I've chosen these little labels because they fit so nicely. This helps stiffen the fabric so that your beadwork doesn't pull in on itself. All right, here I have my beading patterns. I can cut those out. Then I place them on, make sure they match, and make sure the placement is very similar. I like to move them up a little bit closer to the toe because the fur always covers a good inch to inch and a half of the top of the vamp. Then I can pin them in place. You may want to put an extra pin in so things don't wiggle. I suddenly can only find 2. The vamps are now ready and you can lay them on top of the linings. Next, we're going to cut out our leather. All right, I've got my leather laid out. I've placed my moccasin on top of it. Something to note while I tape this up is that leather often has kind of a nice side and a less nice side, or sometimes, like you can see here, they're slightly different colors. For this reason, and because the leather is never perfectly square, I don't usually like to fold and cut like I did for the other pieces because there may be a flaw in the leather, or I may end up wasting pieces because it's not square. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out. Then I'm going to flip this paper over to get the other foot. One last note, I'm not cutting out a vamp because my vamp is made of Melton. I am only cutting out this leather piece now. Now that I've got one foot cut out, I can take my paper off And now I'm going to go back to where I was on my leather. And now I need to tape this down, face down this time, so that it's going to be a mirror image of the first one. Now I've got this one done. And you can see my leather does have a flaw here, but I'm not worried about it because that's going to be on the inside of my shoe. The outside will be this side, and it's always good to just triple check that you do indeed have a left and a right, and we do. The last bit of leather we need to cut is a tiny strip. On this pair, I use some fancy red piping, but for our learning purposes, we're going to use a leather strip, which is also a pretty traditional way to do it. To cut the leather strip, I'm going to look for an edge of the hide that is relatively straight. So this has a shockingly straight edge. It's not usually like this. It doesn't matter if your leather strip you cut is perfectly even all the way along. It'll make sense when I put it together why that's true, but you're going to cut a strip that's about 1 centimeter wide. For length, it's going to need to be long enough to go around both vamps and up the heel here twice. Everybody's moccasins will be a little bit different for length, but once you have that cut, you are very nearly done prepping. All that's left to do now is prep the fur. All right, our last bit of prep is the fur trim that's going to go around the opening of your moccasin. If you bought your fur already in a strip, you don't need to do anything to it. It's already prepped for you. If you bought a rabbit plate, as discussed in my last video, you will need to cut it into strips. And there's a bit of learning that goes into that. The first thing I've done is drawn a few dots 2 inches away from the edge on the side of the pelt where the fur is all pointing down. Okay, so that's the grain of the fur. If you're petting the bunny, you're gonna pet him down. So that's the side where we're gonna cut the strip off. We're cutting 2-inch strips. If you wanna go a little bit thicker, you can, but I don't recommend going any thinner than 2 inches. It just doesn't really work, doesn't look great. I'm gonna draw my line on here so I know exactly where I'm cutting. And then there is a special technique for cutting fur. That's where this guy comes in. So when we cut our fur, we don't want to cut the hairs. We want the hairs to dangle down so it gives this nice, rich, cascading look. If we go ahead and hack in there with scissors like some student did here, we end up with all these kind of sad looking chopped off hairs, and we don't want that. That's why we use a knife instead of scissors. So to avoid cutting the fur underneath, I'm going to lift the pelt up just a little bit, and I'm going to only gently cut the hide. I don't want to cut any of the hairs, only the hide. So you can see here where it preserves that nice soft edge. So you're going to cut all the way along. And there we have it. It looks just like the store-bought version. All right, now that you've got your fur, let's do a quick recap of all of our supplies so that you know you've got everything before you begin. I have prepped my rabbit fur. I have cut 2 leather pieces, 2 vamps with a stabilizer on the back and a beading pattern on the front out of wool. And finally, 2 vamps and 2 bottoms for the lining out of Sherpa. Let's not forget, we also need a thin leather strip to act as piping in the seams, and that is everything you're going to need to get busy assembling your moccasins. Congratulations, you now have a kit that will assemble into a fine pair of moccasins. Next time, we're going to get together and learn how to do the beadwork. After that, it's time to finally assemble.